Hi, I want to welcome you to the CCRS Turnaround Training. I hope you had a good holiday. Today we're going to learn about the Equip rubric, that is, how it began and how we use it. We will then put it into action by evaluating a lesson plan together and then individually. You will have a break between the information and the application of the rubric. The objectives for today: learn what the Equip rubric is and why it came into being and how we can use it. Analyze a lesson using the Equip rubric and the essential planning questions. Enhance a lesson to assure implementation of the CCR standards. And implement the Equip rubric in my own lesson plan from here on out. Well, what is it? It is basically a tool for evaluating the alignment of your lessons with Common Core standards. It stands for Educators Evaluating the Quality of Instructional Products. It began in 2010 as a collaborative effort between Massachusetts, New York, and Rhode Island. They came up with a process by which they could determine key indicators and quality-aligned materials for the Common Core. Word got out and many other states began using the rubric. It addressed the problem with differing ideas of Common Core alignment from differing companies. It helps educators evaluate the quality of instructional materials, including lesson plans. It was designed to evaluate how lessons align to the Common Core standards. These lessons lasted either a few class periods or days that included instructional activities or assessments, or units that extend over a longer period of time. The rubric was not designed to evaluate a single task or activity. Well, why do we need this?
Like it or not, life is full of measuring sticks. How smart we are, how fast we are, how well we can, compete. But up until now, it's been pretty hard to tell how well kids are competing in school and how well they're going to do when they get out of school. We like to think that our education system does that. But when it comes to learning what they really need to be successful after graduation, is a girl in your neighborhood being taught as much as her friend over in the next one? Is a graduating senior in, say, St. Louis as prepared to get a job as the graduate in Shanghai? Well, it turns out the answer to both of these questions is no. Because for years, states have been setting different standards for what students should know and be able to do at each grade level. That's making it too hard to know if our kids are really doing well enough overall, and if they can really compete for a job someday. What we really need are clear goals. That's where the Common Core state standards come in. They're like a total sea change in education. Consistent, strong, clear benchmarks for English language arts and math. Here's how it works. You can think of kindergarten through 12th grade like a giant staircase. Each step is a skill your child needs to learn before stepping up to the next one. But right now, too many kids aren't really confident with like 2 plus 2 before they have to move on to 2 times 2. We need more focus on the skills that help them move up the stairs, or they can slip up and fall behind. And there's another problem. What if everyone's stairs were made at different heights? Well, here we go again. They are. So, a boy in Seattle who's rocking an A in English literature could be getting a C on his Chicago friend's staircase. Oops. We need to create consistent steps in education, too. So first, each standard creates a landing on the staircase, a stop along the way as your child heads toward high school graduation. Each stop is a chance for every parent and teacher to focus on the skills their students are supposed to know at that step, no matter the zip code, language, or race. And more importantly, each standard makes sure all students are learning what they need to know to get to graduation and beyond. Because something like counting to 100 leads to understanding dollars and cents, which eventually leads to understanding how to manage a budget. Secondly, the standards are consistent from school to school, and they match up against international standards too. Now we know how we're doing compared to just about everyone. So even though local communities will still design their own curriculum, with the same rules, everybody can compete on the same kind of staircase. But standards aren't learning. That's why we need teachers, parents, and students to help make that happen. by working together to help kids meet these standards. The world's getting more and more competitive every day. But now, when our kids get to the top of their staircase, they can have way more options on where their life goes from there. Clear goals, confident, well-prepared students. That's the Common Core State Standards.
So now we have the Equip rubric. There are 4 dimensions to this rubric: alignment in the depths of the Common Core standards, key shifts in the CCSS, instructional supports, and assessments. We will go over these in a few minutes. The Equip is designed to allow flexibility in your lessons. Engage you and your colleagues in conversations that are focused on student learning, reflective inquiry, shared ownership, and short and long-term thinking. It builds trust with you, your colleagues, through shared decision-making and frequent communications, and frequent visits to the classroom and consistency. Finally, it's to grow leaders. Through using the Equip rubric, we can hone our skills to become exceptional teachers that impact student lives. We can create and share materials with other professionals in a collaborative environment. The benefits are true collaboration with consistency, equity, efficiency, and cost efficiency, effectiveness, and innovation. The first dimension of the rubric that we're going to talk about is the alignment to the depth of CCSS. There are 4 parts to this dimension. Targeting both your grade level and core standards as well as ELA standards. That's pretty straightforward. Make sure that when you're evaluating the lesson that you read the standard closely and achieve the whole standard to fidelity. Some standards you may only hit a part of it this lesson and a part of it in another lesson, but make sure that you're covering the whole standard to fidelity by the end of the year. Include a clear and explicit purpose for instruction. Basically, this is saying, what are my daily measurable objectives for this standard? Select text or texts that are complex enough and that are sufficient in quality and scope for the purpose. Hopefully this video will give you a better example, a better explanation of this.
Welcome to Let's Chat Core. I'm Sarah Brown Wessling. Today's topic is simplifying text complexity. Our learning purpose today is to learn what comprises text complexity and how to incorporate it purposefully in the classroom. If you're anything like me, knowing where something like text complexity resides within the whole scheme of the Common Core State Standards is really helpful in understanding its purpose and how we use it. So let's take a look at those standards once again. Now, if you remember, we have the math standards, and we also have the literacy standards. Within those literacy standards, there are 4 large strands. There's the writing strand, the reading strand, the speaking and listening strand, as well as the language strand. When we take a closer look at reading, we'll find that text complexity is right within that. This lets us know that text complexity is important in helping us choose the kinds of text that we put in front of our students. One of the goals of reading is to help our students grow in their ability to comprehend, and so choosing the correct text to put in front of them, or the best text, the right fit kind of texts in front of our students becomes really crucial. Now, I just want to remind everybody though that just because text complexity is within reading, is within literacy, it's not just about those English language arts teachers. In fact, text complexity is for any teacher who is putting primary text in front of our students. And as we know, this component of the standards is for all teachers. All teachers in all disciplines are being asked to put primary text in front of their students so that our students really come to understand the role of literacy in that discipline. I think it's time to really unpack what this text complexity is all about. So I kind of want to offer my teacher working definition of text complexity. First of all, when I hear that phrase text complexity, it sounds a little bit scary. That the word complexity in and of itself makes it sound as though the point of this is to put text in front of our students that are really difficult and really hard. And while it is true that we want to make sure that we are constantly challenging our students and constantly giving them something that's just a little bit out of their comfort zone so that they can always be growing in their comprehension, we also need to understand that text complexity is about all of the nuances, the complex ways in which we think about and determine which kinds of text to put in front of our students. And so one of the first myths that we really need to deconstruct here is the idea that just by putting a text that's difficult in front of our students, that's going to make them better readers, because we know that's not true. We know that really it's a lot more nuanced in terms of our approaches. In fact, when I talk to my students about the kinds of texts that are in front of them and the things that we want to read, I want them to find a just right approach. I want them to make sure that they aren't reading something that is so easy that they're not growing, they're not thinking, but I also want to make sure that they're not reading something so challenging that they're having to look up every other word and not being able to string together any kind of comprehension when it comes to that text. So it's important to kind of, I call it the three bears approach. Not too easy, not too hard, just right. But we want to make sure that as we're finding that just right kind of sweet spot for our students, that we're always dialing it up just a tiny bit so that over the course of a year or over the course of a semester or over the course of an experience, students will be able to constantly grow in that way. Not only do we need to make sure that we are putting just right text in front of our students, but when we think about text complexity, it's not just about the difficulty of the text, it's also about the kind of text. And this is a way that we can add complexity to kind of the fabric of our classrooms. So yes, students need to read fiction, yes, they need to read nonfiction, but they also need to be able to read infographics and poetry and film and music videos and graphic novels. And this is why this is so important. If we don't give students the opportunity to transfer their reading skills from one genre to another, one type of text to another, then they kind of become stagnant. And so part of creating text complexity is giving them a variety of texts in order to read. And you know, we probably know this as teachers, as adults, we probably intrinsically understand this because there are times when we encounter texts that are more complex for us, and we have to really slow down when we learn to transfer some of those skills. So when we think about approaching a text, we want to make sure that we are teaching our students those skills of questioning and making inferences and being able to paraphrase and tracing an argument or tracing a thought, but they have to be able to do it in a variety of circumstances. So whether it is a lab report or a blog or a comic book or a financial document, they have to be able to take those skills, reapply them, and that's how we create the kind of environment for our students in which they're not just looking for a right answer. It's how we create the kind of environment that they need in order to really foster some lifelong literacy skills. Another way for us to really think about text complexity, especially in ways to think about adjusting that text complexity, is how we layer the text that we offer students. So, for example, if we are just giving students a text and keeping that in isolation, we'll be able to teach them some skills in order to make sense of that text. And we might even be able to give them a different kind of genre later and ask them to transfer those skills. But another way to consider this is to think about layering texts. So what about having 3 texts kind of in a bundle for students? Maybe there's a comic strip, maybe there is an infographic, maybe there is a journal article. Maybe in another bundle you have a piece of fiction, you have a music video, you have a poem. In those contexts, what you're doing is you're getting students to look at the relationship between these texts, and when they have to compare these texts, either in terms of structure, in terms of vocabulary, in terms of content, in terms of concept, they're going to have to start to dig deeper, and they're going to have to start to look at some of the complex ways in which these texts work. So that's a third way for us to think about bringing text complexity into the classroom. Let's now take a look at how the core really gives us a visual for this text complexity and how the core defines it. So within Appendix A, you'll find that there's this great triangle graphic, and it divides text complexity up into 3 components: the qualitative, the quantitative, and the reader and the task. So what I'd like to do right now is kind of break down these 3. There's some wonderful resources in the appendix that you can read and get a lot of more comprehensive detail, but I want to again just kind of put this in some teacher language for us. So first of all, I want to talk about that quantitative component. And the quantitative component, for me, if I think quantitative and computer, I think about this element as the parts of a text that can be measured by computer software. So this is the word length, the frequency, the sentence length. A lot of you have probably heard about Lexile scores. This is where Lexile scores come from, and this is important because Lexile scores can give us insight into the difficulty of a text, and so it becomes really important. However, we also know that Lexile scores can sometimes be misleading, and I will tell you that when I first read the core and I read this section on text complexity, I felt so liberated because for so long I have been hearing about making sure that we have the right Lexile score for the right kind of reader, and while I agree with that, I've also always known and always believed that sometimes that just doesn't make sense. That, you know, Ernest Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises has a pretty low Lexile score because of the way that he writes his sentences, but I know I'm not putting that book in front of a lot of students who may be able to comprehend the words but not understand the style, not understand the language, not understand the context, and certainly not be ready for the content that's going on in there. So it's important for us to remember that one of the advantages of thinking about text complexity is it's giving us permission to use Lexile scores but also go beyond them. So in addition to the quantitative, we have the qualitative. And the qualitative is kind of in reference to what I was just talking about. This is the human reader. This is the components of any text that can really best be measured by an attentive reader. So an attentive reader can determine the difficulty of language, the purpose of the text, the clarity of it, the kinds of background knowledge demands that a reader might have or might need in order to effectively read this kind of a text. I think one of the best ways to maybe exemplify this is just to offer you an example from one of the favorite parts of my day, which is when I get to read bedtime stories to my own children. So a couple of months ago, I brought home a really fun poetry book that I thought would be great for us to read together. So we're reading this at night, and my 8-year-old is reading the poems, and he knows all of the words in there. And the first 2/3 of every poem he really gets, and he's smiling and kind of laughing. But at the end of every poem, it kind of has a shift, and there's a little bit of a metaphor at the end of every poem. And I realized that I was still laughing at the end of the poem, and he wasn't. Even though he could read every word, he wasn't unpacking the metaphors yet. And so there's a certain degree of background knowledge that he had to have, and when I was able to provide that background knowledge and talk to him about what this double meaning is actually all about, then he was able to make sense of it. But we have to remember that this doesn't just apply to 8-year-olds who are reading poetry with their moms at 8 o'clock at night. It also means that anybody who is working with a text that's unfamiliar to them, or may have vocabulary that they are unfamiliar with, may have text structures that they aren't certain about, will encounter this same kind of difficulty, and so that makes a difference. Another example is when I have oftentimes put graphic novels in front of teachers during some kind of workshop or professional development, and you should see the look on their faces, because a lot of adults maybe haven't read a lot of graphic novels, and so they're not quite sure, where do I start, what do I read next, do I read the things in the bubbles, how does this work? So until you have had access and experience and background knowledge and understanding some of these structural elements of any given text, that qualitative complexity is dialed up, and so we need to think about that. The third component of text complexity is also another area that I have felt really validated in. The reader and task element of this essentially lets us know that the teacher is so crucial in making sure that the task that he or she is asking the student to do with that text is a really good match. And in just a bit, I'll talk about how we can use this matching as a way to dial up or dial down the text complexity. But when we think about the marriage between reader and task, learning purpose becomes absolutely crucial. As teachers, we must know what our purpose for teaching is, what we want students to learn, and what our purpose for putting that particular text in front of the student is. Because when we have a clear understanding of that purpose, I think we are much more likely to be able to connect the reader and the task in really beneficial ways. So now that we've kind of broken down these three components of text complexity, I want to go back to the classroom, and I want us to spend the end of this webinar kind of thinking about what it actually means to teach with text complexity in mind. So the first thing is that if I am teaching with text complexity in mind, I have to know my students. I have to know what their background knowledge is. I do have to know about their Lexile score or what their reading ability is, but I can't make all of my determinations based on that single criteria anymore. And that is what I think is so wonderful about the three-pronged approach to text complexity, is that it gives us an opportunity to see readers in a more multifaceted way, and it gives us a chance to see our texts in a more multifaceted way. So we have to know our students, their background knowledge, their vocabulary needs, the kinds of structures that they're familiar with and the ones that they're unfamiliar with. And when we know that, we'll be able to offer them and give them texts that are just right for them, and texts that allow them to continue to grow as readers. The second thing that we really can do in order to make sure that we are adhering to text complexity in purposeful ways is to have a good match between that task and text. So my personal philosophy on the text that I have and use in class is that the more difficult the skill that I am teaching, or the more complex the concept is that I want to teach, the less difficult the actual text needs to be, the more accessible that actual text needs to be. So for example, when I am working with seniors who are studying literary theory, which is something that is often done in colleges and universities, and it's a way that literary critics look at literature, I don't introduce that to them with Beowulf or Shakespeare or even Catcher in the Rye. Instead, we start with nursery rhymes, because nursery rhymes are really accessible pieces of text. They're short, you can reread them many times, you can unpack them quickly, and what it allows them to do is it allows them to practice these complex thinking and conceptual skills with very accessible text. And once they own those skills, then we start to dial up the complexity of the text, and that's a good match between them. So it's important for us to remember, the more difficult the task, the more difficult the concept, the more accessible the text. Finally, I think that there is a mistake that I know I have certainly made in the classroom, and I think it's one that I have really learned from, which is this idea of trying to walk through the exit door, that instead of thinking about starting right where my students are at and scaffolding them towards some end, exit point that I want them to achieve, sometimes I get nervous. I get nervous when I look at those standards. I get nervous when I think about the expectations that we have for our students. And I think, if I start too easy, or if I start too slow, if I start with texts that are too short, we're never going to get there. And what I have learned is that if I put texts that are too difficult, those exit level texts, if I put those exit level texts in front of my students at the beginning before they're ready, it's completely unproductive. They're not able to work with them, they're not able to learn from them, and instead it's so much more effective to start slow, to start with accessible text, and to work up, consistently work up, so that when they get to those really complex texts, they feel confident, they feel ready, and they're really able to flourish. Now that we have demystified a little bit of text complexity, broken down those three major components, done a little bit of thinking about how we might consider implementing this in the classroom, I wanted to offer a few reflective prompts that might get you to think about how to apply this to your own teaching scenario. So the first prompt reads, one way to start thinking about matching text and readers is to begin with what you already have. So take a text that you teach frequently. Now consider how you would make that text more complex by changing the task. So this is one way that we dial up text complexity. We change the task, not the text. A second prompt for you to think about. Now take a task that is often very challenging for students. Think about how you could scaffold it with more accessible text. So I want you to think about shorter texts. I want you to think about non-traditional texts. Are there ways that you can match text with task in that way? Finally, another way to increase complexity is in juxtaposing or comparing texts. So how could you take a central text that you have in your class, how could you make it more complex through comparison? Conversely, how could you make it more accessible? These are some good questions for us to think about, for us to ponder, perhaps for us to collaborate with others on as well. Thank you for joining me with this edition of Let's Chat Core. Just a couple of reminders. Text.
If you are teaching a unit or longer, the lesson should include integrating reading, writing, speaking skills so that the students actually apply and synthesize these skills into their everyday lives. You may have to build the students' content knowledge through coherent selection of text. The second dimension of the rubric is the key shifts. These are reading text closely. Students may have to read and reread the text, annotating ideas and information and paying attention to hinge words. Having text-based evidence. Students need to be able to ask questions and or be able to answer questions about the text. They also have to be able to cite examples from the text. Writing from sources. They must be able to read and synthesize information from various sources, comparing and contrasting the information to come up with the document that incorporates their knowledge. An academic vocabulary. We have overused synonyms and left out the choice of words that the author thought was important. We need to decide which academic vocabulary to teach and go over those. I know we won't have time to go over all of them, and we can give synonyms to those if needed. As we go over vocabulary, the students will develop a web of words and learn synonyms for those words. If you are teaching a unit or longer, your lesson should include increased text complexity, building disciplinary knowledge, balance of text, and a balance of writing. Now, before we begin on the third dimension, I'd like to go over some definitions. What exactly is 100% student engagement? Well, talking. Students responding to teacher questions individually does not count as talking. However, if the teacher poses a question and the students discuss the question, it does count as talking. Writing is not copying notes from a PowerPoint. However, reading and taking margin notes is writing. Marking on a graphic organizer that is just checking agree or disagree is not writing, but however, completing a box like a so what box at the bottom of a T-chart is writing. Investigating can be a lab situation, or it can be simply digging into text or probing more deeply into a discussion or text by questioning and using technology. Reading can be silent, aloud, or with partners, so long as 100% of the students have the opportunity to read. And listening. Students can prove that they are listening by explaining what they heard their partner or the peer group saying during the discussion. Instructional supports is a third dimension of the rubric. Basically, these are your strategies that will help you focus and pace your lessons appropriately. What literacy standards will require all 100% of your students to engage in content through reading, writing, talking, listening, and investigating. You need to make sure that your strategies hit these supports. Cultivate student interest and engagement in reading, writing, speaking about text. Addressing instructional expectations. Providing all students with multiple opportunities to engage in text complexity with scaffolding as needed. Focus on challenging selections of text and engage students in productive struggle to build independence. Integrate appropriate support and/or extensions for students as needed. If you are teaching a unit or longer, your lesson should include progression of learning that deepens over time, gradually removing support to aid in independence, provide authentic learning, integrate targeted instructions as needed, and indicate how students are accountable for independent reading. Use technology and media to deepen learning and draw attention to the evidence. The last dimension is assessment. What actions will you take to assess throughout the lesson? Assessment elicits direct, observable evidence to the degree to which a student can independently demonstrate the major targeted grade level CCSS standard with appropriate complex text. If you are always working in groups, you will not be able to assess independently. The methods must be unbiased and accessible to all students. They must be aligned with a rubric or assessment guidelines that provide sufficient guidance for interpreting student performance. If you are teaching a unit or longer, your lesson should include varied modes of assessment, including a range of pre, formative, summative, and self-assessment measures. We're going to view a very short video about peer assessment. Even though the video is about a first grader, it can be applicable to high school students. The name of the video is Austin's Butterfly.
What would you guys say to teachers if they're not getting high quality work? Could they learn something from this, and what would you say to them that they could do differently in their classrooms?
This is a story called Austin's Butterfly, and it's a true story about a first grade boy, and his name is Austin, and he goes to school, or used to go to school, in a town called Boise, Idaho. And in his class in Boise, Idaho, they were studying butterflies, and he had to do a project. His job in first grade was to draw a butterfly, and this is the butterfly that he picked. Austin had to use this photograph as his model, and he had to draw an accurate scientific drawing of this butterfly. This is called a tiger swallowtail.
I knew it!
Can you tell, Toby, why it's called tiger?
Because it kind of has the stripes of the tiger right there.
Good. So, here was Austin's job. He was supposed to do a scientific drawing of that butterfly. But remember, Austin was only in first grade. And you know what he did? he forgot to look like a scientist carefully. He got his paper and he just started to draw the image of a butterfly that he had in his head. And he wasn't looking like a scientist, and so this is what he drew.
Whoa.
It's not bad, and it is a butterfly, but does it look exactly like this?
No.
No, it doesn't yet. It doesn't look exactly like this yet. And so they didn't look at this and say, good, Austin, you're done. They said, Austin, good start. Now we can start giving you critique so you can do a second draft and make it better, and a third draft and make it better, and you can make it much, much closer to this. And he was ready to go. All of the first graders in his critique group sat on the floor like you guys are, and they decided to split their advice into two kinds. First, just the shape of the wings. And then when the shape was right, they'd give him advice about the pattern inside the wings. Alia, what would you say?
You can make it much pointier.
Good. These wings could be much pointier. Who else would add something? Atak, what would you say?
How about the angle? Because, not to be mean about
Yes.
the angle, it's just not exact, so...
Okay, so show me. Come on up here, Atak. Show me what you would ask him to do slightly differently.
like to make it a little longer,
Longer where? Draw where you would do it.
right there.
Okay, so pull this out longer.
Yeah.
That's very specific, Atak. Thank you. Jamila, what would you say?
It's like triangle.
Good. Jamila, I love that. So you're saying more like a triangle shape. And I agree. Well, you know what? Those first graders came up with most of those same ideas. And you know what Austin said? He said, okay, I'll go try. And he went back to his seat and he drew this.
Wow.
Does this look more like a triangle?
Yeah.
Yeah. Did he go out further, like Atak was suggesting?
Yes.
Yeah.
Did he add some jaggedness here,
Yes.
like Cindy? Did he get rid of that bottom thing?
Yes.
So he did listen to his friends, and he made it better. It's not perfect. Toby, what would you say?
I'd say don't put those little tail things so pointed in. I'd say put them more pointed down.
Good. Okay, and Ethan, what would you say?
I think you should make the wings like this, not like just like
Okay, he listened to his friends, and they said, this is really a lot better, Austin. That second draft really is better.
Yeah, maybe you can make a third one.
Good. Maybe he could make a third draft. And so he did this draft.
That's the third draft.
That's his third draft, Hadley. That's just right. Elijah, what do you notice there?
Well, one wing's more pointed than the other, and that side is a little bit higher than the others.
Good. Coburn?
Right here, it doesn't have the inside thing still.
Ah, okay. Needs a little bit more of that notch. So, do you think maybe he should do a fourth draft?
Yeah.
Well, that's just what he said. He said, shoot, okay, I got round again. I'll go back and do a fourth draft.
Listen.
He listened. Does it look more even like Elijah was suggesting?
Yes.
Yeah. And does it look like it's coming out a little sharper, like Cindy was suggesting? And like Attack was saying, it's a little, the angle looks a little better. So now Austin was feeling really good. He said, am I ready to add some pattern? And they said, okay, why don't you try adding some of the pattern? And he did.
He's good at it. He is so good.
And then they said, Austin, you're ready for color. Let's look at his last draft. And what do you think? Did it come out really good?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually looks
What do you think about how much progress he made? And Tak, what would you say about his progress?
He made, like, a lot of progress. He persevered doing it. His friends were honest with him.
What was it about the kinds of advice that they gave that allowed him to get better each time? Hassan?
Well, they told him what was wrong about it.
Did they say it's just wrong, or were they more specific than that?
They were more specific, but they weren't mean about it.
Great. Hadley.
Made 6 drafts.
And so is that something that other kids should learn from? What should we learn from that?
We can make other drafts if it's not right.
Good. So if it's not right, you can keep doing more drafts to make it better.
You just don't use things in your head. You want to use a sharp eye.
Good. He used the eyes of a scientist. Great.
If you would like to learn more about creating a culture of critique, there is a link. This slide is optional, but it does provide the link that you can use next. Break time. You have 15 minutes for a break. Now we are going to analyze a content lesson using the Equip rubric. This lesson comes from the ALEX website, but remember it was written before we had the CCRS standards. After you analyze this, you will determine what needs to be added. You have the following handouts. The essential planning questions. This will help you meet all the requirements of the Equip rubric. The Equip rubric, which we've already gone over. Literacy standards for grades 6 through 12. This is a comprehensive list of literacy standards for history, social studies, and technical subjects. College and career readiness anchor standards for all grades. The CTE lesson plan to evaluate. Standards used in that CTE plan. You have the lesson analysis graphic organizer. Your mission. Using your handouts, evaluate the lesson, employer, personnel issues. Use the essential planning questions and the Equip rubric to evaluate if the lesson has each part. If it doesn't, write down what the teacher needs to do to meet the CCSS standards in the rubric. After you're done, share with your group your ideas to enhance the lesson. Allow about 10 minutes for discussion. Facilitator, when everyone is through, please go to the next slide. Our goal. To align every lesson plan with the Equip rubric. Remember, it is not designed to evaluate a single task or activity. It has to be a complete lesson. To be able to meet all the parts of the rubric to fidelity. We know this will not happen overnight, but the more you use the Equip rubric, the easier it will become. Teachers will reflect on their practice both orally and in writing, and student achievement will improve. Your homework. Take one of your lessons and look and use what you have learned about the Equip rubric to evaluate yourself. Look at the evidence of the student assessment or work that goes along with the lesson. Did it meet your objectives? Create a reflection piece about your lesson, how you met or didn't meet the Equip rubric, and how you can improve. Turn these into your principal or his or her designee. They will evaluate it according to the Equip electronic review. This is exactly the same as the rubric, but it leaves area for notes. You can Google this or just write down the link if you would like to see it for yourself. Now, we learned, and this will be due January 19th of this year. We learned what the Equip rubric was, how it came into being, and how we can use it. We analyzed a lesson using the Equip rubric and the essential planning questions. We enhanced that lesson to assure there was implementation of CCR standards to fidelity. Now we will implement the rubric in our own lessons. These are resources that I used if you'd like to look them up. I enjoyed doing this video, and I hope it has helped you learn more about the Equip rubric.